The topic of exorcism has been a source of entertainment and fear for decades. Movies like The Exorcist in 1973 and The Exorcism of Emily Rose in 2005 have truly captivated audiences, in part due to that tagline, based on a true story. So, how true are these stories and how do they compare? In the case of The Exorcist, it's the story of Ronald Hunkeler, a 14-year-old boy from Cottage City, Maryland, who became possessed after the passing of his Aunt Harriet. For Emily Rose, it's the tale of Anneliese Michel, a 23-year-old woman from Bavaria, Germany, who was said to be host to 6 demons. Welcome to History, Mystery, and the Unexplained, the show where we look at everything from true crime to cryptids, the paranormal, and beyond. Today, we're going to look at the real-life cases of exorcism, including Ronald Hunkeler, Anneliese Michel, and more. Before we get started, please like, subscribe, follow, or whatever on the platform of your choice. And be sure to leave us a review. I'd love to hear what you think. Anneliese Michel was born September 21st, 1952, in Leafing, Germany. She was a devout Catholic who attended church twice a week. In September of 1968, at the age of 16, she passed out while attending class for unknown reasons. Later that night, she had her first seizure. It would be another year before she would have another seizure, and her parents would take her to a neurologist for examination. At this time, she was diagnosed with temporal lobe epilepsy, but no form of treatment was offered to her. Although the diagnosis meant that she could suffer from spasms, memory loss, and hallucination, doctors didn't think it was frequent enough issue to warrant a treatment plan. As time went on, she only got worse. Between 1969 and 1970, Michel suffered from tuberculosis, pneumonia, pleurisy, tonsillitis, and issues with her heart and circulatory system. On June 3rd, 1970, she had another bout of seizures while she was in the Mittenberg Clinic recovering. It was at this time she started receiving medication for her mental and physical health issues. It was also at this time that she first begun to question her ailments and whether or not they had a paranormal origin. She was praying and she saw a demonic face appear before her. It was enough to cause her to not pray anymore. When she moved away to college in 1973, things got even worse. She heard voices damning her soul to hell and heard knocking sounds. She was forced to return home and quit her schooling. Frustrated after 5 years of conventional doctors and being unable to treat her ailments, her family turned to the church looking for answers. Most of the priests they spoke with encouraged her to continue the path of medical science. Her father took her on a trip to the San Damiano Church in Assisi, Italy, in 1973, and Michel refused to enter. She said that the ground burned like fire and the images of biblical figures blinded her with a piercing white light. It was around this time that her mother also witnessed her eyes go black as she stared at a figure of the Virgin Mary. They continued to plead with priests for intervention, finally convincing Father Ernest Alt to take on the case. He took one look at Anneliese and said she didn't look like an epileptic. In the Catholic Church, exorcisms require the approval of the bishop of the diocese, and Bishop Joseph Stengel refused to give his approval and once again encouraged the family to contact doctors. Things got even worse, if that's possible. She began destroying religious items around the house, eating spiders and coal, and she even bit the head off a dead bird in the family's backyard. She crawled under the table and barked like a dog, refusing to leave for 2 days. Bishop Stengel finally gave his approval and asked the family to keep it quiet. Being as this was around the same time as the release of the movie The Exorcist, this may have contributed to the bishop's decision. Publicly, the church was very critical of the movie. Exorcisms, especially in the 70s, were very controversial. Nonetheless, Father Alt finally had his green light, and in addition to the approval, Bishop Stengel appointed a priest named Father Arnold Renz to assist in the rite. The first of many exorcisms occurred on September 24th, 1974. In total, 67 exorcisms were performed over the course of 10 months. During this time, Anneliese stopped eating, saying that the demons would not allow it. She would also repeatedly drop to her knees in prayer with such force that she ripped her tendons and shattered bones in both legs. She was covered in bruises, had broken teeth, and her nose bled constantly. Throughout the months, she would argue with herself in different voices as the exorcisms were being performed. She claimed to be possessed by Judas Iscariot, Christ's disciple that betrayed him, Cain, the murderous son of Adam and Eve, the Roman Emperor Nero, Adolf Hitler, and a disgraced German priest from the 1500s named Valentin Fleischmann. Finally, she was possessed by Lucifer himself. Now, it's noted that these names could have just been there to induce fear in the priests, and that they were not the actual souls that had taken possession of Anneliese. Either way, it was Anneliese's belief that she was suffering for the sins of the youth of her generation and for the sins of the priests of the Catholic Church. She said that she was visited by the Virgin Mary and told that this was her fate. When she wasn't talking during the rites, she would vomit or scream in agony. Her body would go rigid, or at times she would throw herself against the walls. She predicted her own death, saying that her suffering would end in July. Her last exorcism was June 30th, 1976, and her mother found her on July 1st deceased in her own bed. Autopsies found that 23-year-old Anneliese Michel weighed only 68 pounds at the time of her death. Malnutrition and dehydration were the cause of her passing. What's interesting is that the autopsy of her brain found that she was healthy. There was no damage present that would cause epileptic seizures. Her parents and the two priests were arrested and stood trial. The court deemed her mentally ill and argued that the exorcism actually made her worse, playing into her delusion. The church, on the other hand, truly believed that this was a case of demonic possession and they were doing the right thing. They played the 42 recordings of the various exorcisms of Anneliese as proof. The court was unswayed. Her parents, Anna and Joseph Michel, were found guilty of negligent homicide, but were not given any sentence as the death of their child was deemed painful enough. Likewise, the two priests were found guilty of negligent manslaughter and given 6 months. Their sentences, however, were dropped. Now, I'm not here to say whether or not this is a real case of possession. It is a case that has been extensively studied and has strong believers on both sides. Here is just a small example of the recordings of Anneliese. There's a link below for those who want the full hour-and-a-half long recording, if you're interested. Even though the recordings are in German, you don't need to speak the language for it to send a chill up your spine. Although not one of the stories I mentioned earlier, I found the tale of 21-year-old Donnie Decker truly interesting and bizarre. As such, it's worth a mention here before we move forward. On February 24th, 1983, Donnie got leave from prison to attend the funeral of his grandfather, James Kishaw. Seeing people mourn for his grandfather really upset young Decker. Unbeknownst to most of those attending, his grandfather had abused him from the time that he was 7 years old. He spent the next day with a couple of friends, Bob and Jenny Keffer, when he went into some sort of trance. Rain began to fall from the walls and ceiling, flooding the home. The landlord was called, but there was no source of the water that could be found. A short time later, before going back to prison to finish his sentence for receiving stolen items, he was at a restaurant with the Keffers just across the street from their home, when once again rain began to come down indoors. Pam Scrofano, the owner of the restaurant, described the events as follows. You looked at Donnie and it was like he was in a trance. He would look at you, but not knowing you were there. I said to Jenny, he's got to be possessed. We're sitting there. A couple of seconds later, there's water falling all over the pizzeria too. I've never seen anything like it. I went to the cash register. I had a crucifix there and I took it out and I put it on him. And the minute I put it on him, it touched his skin and he got burned. There's no way that anybody could have played a joke like that. It was real. Donnie was doing it himself. He was doing it without realizing it. The next day, police came to the Keffers' home and asked Donnie Decker some questions. Police officer Bill Davis and Lieutenant John Ruddle said that they witnessed Donnie levitate across the room, flying to the other side as if hit by a bus. Again, it started to pour, and crosses burned his body. I've been a cop for 40 years, Bill Davis said. I've never seen anything like this. Never. When he returned to jail, Donnie suddenly realized that he could control it. He focused on the rain and water poured from the concrete. The warden called Reverend William Blackburn. Donnie Decker told the Reverend of his plight. He explained that crosses would burn him and that he could make it rain at will. The Reverend told him to stop lying. Then the room filled with a foul stench of death. Donnie raised his hand and a mist filled the room. The Reverend pulled out his Bible and began praying immediately. Amazingly, the Bible didn't get wet, but Reverend Blackburn said that there was a moment where he saw a change in Donnie. He subsided and he could feel a peace. They hugged and prayed together, and the rain events just ended. The Reverend was convinced that this was a case of demonic possession. Commonly known by the pseudonyms Ronald Doe or Robbie Mannheim, 14-year-old Ronald Hunkeler was the boy that inspired the book and movie The Exorcist. In January of 1949, Ronald's Aunt Harriet passed away. Being an only child, his aunt had been one of his closest playmates growing up. It is often noted that she was a spiritualist who had introduced Ronald to Ouija boards. This may or may not have had anything to do with Ronald's possession, but it's worth noting as the strange behavior in the Hunkeler's Cottage City, Maryland home started immediately after her death. In the beginning, noises were heard, tapping or dripping. Furniture would move on its own and objects would be seen levitating around the room. These things only seemed to happen in Ronald's presence. The initial assumption was that it was the spirit of Harriet. They asked the spirit to leave them alone, and it seemed to only make things worse. The Hunkeler family had long been faithful Lutherans, and as such, they went to their local pastor, Luther Mile Schultz. Schultz had an interest in parapsychology and wanted to study the boy. He had Ronald Hunkeler spend the night in his home so he could observe the child's behavior. Throughout the night, Schultz noted the same actions as what had happened in the Hunkeler home. Objects and furniture moved on their own. Schultz advised that the family reach out to the Catholic Church. Ronald was admitted to Georgetown University Hospital in Washington, D.C., where he received his first exorcism by Edward Hughes. Hughes strapped Ronald to his hospital bed. He begun the rites of exorcism. As Father Hughes prayed, Ronald worked his right hand free, and he dug one of the springs out of the mattress and seized the opportunity to slash Hugh's arm. Wounded and bleeding, the priest could not proceed. During the day, Ronald seemed like a perfectly ordinary teenage boy. But at night, the strangeness continued, and it continued to increase. His bed would shake, scratches would appear on his body. At times, these scratches even spelled out words. Among them were the words Lewis, spelled out across Ronald's ribs. Odell, Ronald's mother, was from St. Louis, and she had been considering taking Ronald there to visit her mother. She figured it would be a great escape from the events of the home. The problem was that the events had less to do with the home and far more to do with Ronald himself. Shortly after Ronald and his mother arrived at the home in Belnor, Missouri, a northwestern suburb of St. Louis, several family members witnessed the bed shake and move on its own. His cousin was a student at St. Louis University, which was a Jesuit institution. He went to Father Raymond J. Bishop at the school and told him what was going on. After a meeting between the family, Bishop, and the school president, Bishop agreed to go to the Belnor home and pray with Ronald. During his visit, he saw scratches as if claws appeared on his stomach, and he observed the bed moving and shaking on its own. Bishop then went to Father William S. Bodern, the pastor of St. Francis Xavier Church in St. Louis, and enlisted his help. Father Bodern was a more experienced priest than Bishop, and he agreed to take the lead on the case. From March 11th until the 16th, the two priests observed Ronald in his home, gathering the needed information for the exorcism. Finally, on the 16th, they received permission from the Archbishop and began. The exorcism took more than a month, finally concluding on April 18th, the day after Easter. In Alexian Brothers Hospital, the priests surrounded Ronald's bed with religious artifacts and called upon St. Michael to battle the devil for control of Ronald's body. Ronald contorted violently, and then, as if coming out of a daze, he simply said, "He's gone." Now, there are, of course, those who will say that Ronald Hunkeler was mentally ill, or that he faked it all for attention, or to get out of school or something. Schultz has also been accused of exaggerating his observations by parapsychologist Joseph Banks Rhine. In the writings of Raymond Bishop in what has become known as the Exorcist Diary, the source work for the original novel, he has been accused of embellishing a lot of the happenings. And maybe if this story ended there, I would accept that. But unlike the fictitious Hollywood sensation, neither priest died. No one threw themselves down a flight of stairs. Ronald's back didn't snap in half, leaving him paralyzed like Reagan. Hunkeler went on to become a NASA scientist, contributing to the Apollo missions and patenting a high-temperature ceramic compound for use in shielding to allow re-entry into the atmosphere. He passed away on May 10th, 2020, at the age of 85. Our final story tonight is that of Clara Germana Cele. Born in 1890, young Clara was orphaned as a child, finding herself at St. Michael's Mission in Natal, South Africa, from the age of 4. She was described by the nuns who ran the school and by her fellow students as a normal girl. She was bright and studious and a devout Catholic. At the age of 16, however, things started to change. Her behavior became erratic. She yelled to one of the nuns to fetch Father Erasmus. She needed to make a confession. Father Horner Erasmus came at once to hear what the young girl had to say, and she confessed to making a deal with the devil. Then, before everyone assembled, she began to argue with the demon inside her. "You have betrayed me," she said. "You promised me days of glory, but now you treat me cruelly." As time went on, Clara was seen tearing at her clothes, carrying on conversations with unseen entities. She would speak and understand multiple languages, including Polish, German, French, Norwegian, and others, ones that she was never taught. At times, she would growl like a beast. One nun described the noises she made as follows: "No animal has ever made such sounds, neither the lions of East Africa nor the angry bulls. At times, it sounded like a veritable herd of wild beasts, orchestrated by Satan, had formed a hellish choir." Finally, Clara Cele begun to levitate. Holy objects and water burned her flesh and caused her to recoil. Even holy objects concealed and snuck into the room bothered her by their presence. Among the more outlandish claims were that Clara became clairvoyant, often knowing details and events about the nuns' personal lives. She also was noted to transform into a snake-like creature, slithering through the halls of the school. In one incident, she bit a nun, leaving a mark like a snake's fangs. Her confessor, Father Erasmus, along with another priest, Reverend Mancini, who was the director of the school, received permission from the church to perform an exorcism. They began on September 11th, 1906. Throughout the ritual, Clara lashed out violently. She knocked a Bible out of one priest's hands, grabbed the stole of another one, and attempted to choke him with it. On the second day of the exorcism, before a crowd of 170 people who bore witness in the chapel, Clara levitated 5 feet above the air. Then her body fell back to the bed, and the priest declared her free of the devil's influence. A second exorcism was performed a year later, again lasting 2 days. This time, a foul stench filled the air when the demon departed her body. She went on to live another 5 years, free from possession. By many accounts, she was embarrassed by her actions when she was possessed and asked for forgiveness, dedicating her life to humble service. She passed away in 1912 at the age of 22 due to heart failure. Her body was cremated, but it's unknown where she was interred. Now, there are so many tales of demonic possession, that some of which have inspired movies, some that did not, but all that are just truly fascinating. So rather than try to condense those all into one episode, we're going to make this a two-parter. So that's it for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tune in next week for the continuation of Real Life Tales of Exorcism, when we look at the stories that inspired The Conjuring 3, The Exorcist of Anna Eklund, and more. Until then, I'm Christopher Damian. This is History, Mystery, and the Unexplained. And thank you for listening.